Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Astronomical Society of Edinburgh and our meeting in person and online tonight. Welcome was going to be done by our president, Mark Phillips, but unfortunately he's got a nasty eye infection and has stayed at home and looking after that, and hopefully somebody's looking after it for him. So I'm Peter Black, I'm one of the vice presidents here, and we introduce tonight's agenda. We have this amazing talk, it sounds like, on Mary Somerville, which is Ruth has done at the last minute for us, which is great. And then we have the Sky and Maeve from the indomitable Alan Pickup. So it was an amazing pair of braces on, so I'm sure that's going to jazz it up. Yeah, there's one there behind you, actually, but I hadn't quite got to that yet. So now that we've got to it, any new members here tonight? Yes. Yeah, welcome. Eros Tang, is Eros here tonight? No. Eros still is making fantastic images, as we can see here. So well done, Eros. So coming soon, we have our usual imaging and observing group for members. And then we have a talk about William Lassell, and I don't know anything about him, so that'll be interesting. Except that it looks like he telescopes planets and drinking beer. That sounds like something that we actually do quite a lot, I think. And then talk on dark energy and dark matter. So that's by Professor Andy Taylor. So that's coming up in the relatively near future. So this is our talk for this evening. And at that point, I'll hand over to Ruth. I'll give you the plug.
Yes, I always need plugging in at some point. Thank you so much to Nigel for actually making my evening on Wednesday. I'd had a bit of a rough week with drainage problems in the flat, which you don't really need to know about, but I was feeling very fed up. And I got home after work, logged onto my emails. Would you give a talk about Mary? That's all I needed to know, to be honest. I would have said yes, no matter when it was. I am slightly obsessed about this woman, and the photograph that is on the slide at the moment is the closest I've ever been able to get to a selfie with my heroine. This is a portrait that I will talk more about later on, but it's at Somerville College down in Oxford. So when I was staying there, I very much wanted to get a photograph with it. Mary Somerville is someone I've been obsessed with, and I am obsessed for several years. I'm working on a biography, although, like any writer, I need more time and money. So if anyone here happens to have a spare million stuck down a sofa or anything, hello, please come and talk to me afterwards. But she is someone that has fascinated me, and I'm continuing to do research. I should stress, I'm not a scientist. I'm not a mathematician. I'm not an astronomer either. Although, I hope you approve of my dress. When I was thinking about what to wear tonight, I suddenly went, I've got a dress with the northern lights on. That'll do. I don't really know much else about the sky, I'm afraid, but I will learn tonight, definitely. But what I am obsessed about is history. It's something I have always grown up with. My dad started the Captain Cook Society the year that I was born, and he is still the editor of the society. In fact, my first crush as a child was Joseph Banks. Although, obviously, he wasn't really an option, but although he was rich, I think that may have been partly it as well. But history has been part of my childhood, part of my life for as long as I can remember. And what fascinates me is how people lived. We as human beings have never really changed. We need shelter, we need food and water, we need love, we need companionship to keep going and something to occupy us. And although technology has changed over the centuries, those needs are still always there. So I want to tell you today the story of Mary. And the more I've done research into her, the more I've realised the importance of her education. Now, if you read anything about Mary, it quite often says she received no education apart from 1 year at school. And in some ways that is true, but she still did receive an education. She was a female. She needed to be educated in order to attract a husband. And one thing I hope to show tonight is actually that education she received as a female really helped her in her career as a scientist. But firstly, I want to start off by telling you how I discovered Mary Somerville. And to do this, we have to go way back to 2005, when I worked for the National Library of Scotland, so just down the road from here, and I was the John Murray Archive project curator. And there's a photograph of me looking much, much younger. John Murray Archive was this incredible archive that came about from the publishing firm John Murray. They'd been established in London in 1768 by the first John Murray. He'd been involved, we think, perhaps in the Jacobites fighting up here, and so when he escaped down to London, he dropped to the Muck part of his name and became just simply Murray when he was down there. Started up a publishing firm in 1768. 2002 is when the seventh John Murray sold it to Hodder Headline. So it still exists as an imprint. You'll still see the JM on the spine of some books. At the time of the sale in 2002, it was the oldest independent publishing firm in the UK. It had been in the same family all of those centuries, and every single generation it had been run by a John Murray, which when you're doing research is really annoying. If you've ever done family history research, you'll know what I mean. Just choose another name. The archive, though, they decided as a family not to keep because they knew its worth. They wanted people to be able to use it, but they wanted it to come back to Scotland. The family had always kept connections with Scotland, and this is where they were originally from. They had the archive valued, and its valuation was £44 million. And then they approached the National Library with a bargain. They would knock a little bit of money off, and so long as we could get £33 million, it was ours. Oh, well, that should be easy to do. Only 33 million, amazing. Why was it so expensive? I'll name some of the people that they published in the 19th century and see how many you know. Lord Byron, Jane Austen, David Livingstone, Charles Darwin, Queen Victoria. These are just 5 of the names of the many authors that they published, but help to illustrate why the archive was so expensive. It's the largest Byron collection in the world, for example. But not everything in the archive was known about. The big names, absolutely, but the vast majority of the archives were in the white boxes you can see in the shelves to the right of this photograph. This is Ginny Murray, the wife of the 7th John Murray. And she and her husband had made sure that all the archive was being looked after, so they're in proper archival boxes in a storage facility in the building, but being properly looked after. And so my job for about 9 months was to go down to London every week to Albemarle Street, this incredible building that had been in the family since 1812, and to go through some of the lesser known items to see if there were any names that we could pull out. I must stress, though, that there was one part of the archive they weren't selling us, and I was quite grateful for that, for they also had the collection of hair that Byron had been sent by female admirers, and let's just say it wasn't from the head that it came from. So I was quite glad that we didn't get that as part of the archive. I have no idea how you would catalogue that. Anyway, it doesn't bear thinking about. But one day I was sitting in Albemarle Street, and I thought, let's look at S. Just pluck any letter out. And this white box was brought up, and I opened it, and I took out a letter. It was from someone I'd never heard of before, but it intrigued me. It was written from Florence on the 28th of March, 1857, and it starts, "Dear Mr. Murray, I was pleased to hear from Mr. Pentland that the Council of Education has adopted my physical geography, and that a new edition will be required immediately. But I must protest against it going to press till it is brought up to the present time. I've already completely recast the chapter on the ocean. I want much information on Africa, an article that must be entirely rewritten. The gold mines of California and Australia were not discovered when the last edition were printed, which will show you how far it is behind." So a bit more information about books that she needs, swapping a bit of family details and the like. And then on the second page, a paragraph that just made me laugh. I could almost see her kind of leaning over the garden fence and going, "Psst, have you heard? The David Brewster, aged 76, and note she's underlined the age there, was married a few days ago to Miss Parnell, aged 26. A grocer's daughter. So David and his daughter have been living at Cairns, which he left a few days before the wedding without saying a word to his daughter of his engagement, but left her with the Duchess Dowager of Argyll, who had to tell her of it. I loved this. Here you had a letter, only 2 pages long, the first, very serious, very businesslike, from a woman to a publisher saying, you're not allowed to republish until I've rewritten things. And then this very human need to gossip. For me, this letter encapsulates what Mary has become to me. And I fell in love with her there and then, and I've been doing research on her ever since. Mary Somerville was an incredible woman. She made important contributions to scientific writing, experimental science, at a time when science itself wasn't properly defined. She wrote on a range of subjects to ensure a wider audience than previous had been able to understand scientific ideas and practices. The term scientist was first used in print in a review of one of her books. So she is the first scientist. So we should talk about scientists and male scientists from now on. And if you do nothing else after tonight, I want you to remember that fact. She's also worth looking at because she lived for 91 years. From 1780 to 1872, she went from the Georgian period through to the Victorian age. The changes that she saw were incredible. In 1887, so after she had died, she was called in a magazine the most remarkable scientific woman our country has produced. There was hardly any branch of art, of knowledge, which Somerville did not delight in. So I'm going to talk a bit more about her, but of course, anybody's stories always start with their birth. She was born in December 1780. Her father was a naval man, and he was being sent off to war, and her mother wanted to spend as much time with him as possible. Now, this may have had something to do with the fact that the last time he'd set sail, he had been captured and had been kept a prisoner of war by the French for 2 years. So we think that his wife was going, no, okay, I just need, every day I can have with you is a joy. So even though she was almost full term in pregnancy, she travelled all the way down to London with him to wave him off. She then gets back on her carriage, comes back up to Scotland. They lived in Burnt Island, but she only got as far as Jedburgh when she, in the words of the autobiography, got caught short, which females amongst you who have been pregnant and given birth may feel that that isn't a fully accurate description of going into labour, but she got caught short. Luckily, her sister lived in Jedburgh. So she kind of knocked on the door. I would love to have seen the face. Knocked on the door and said, I'm giving birth, can I come in? So it was in Jedburgh, in the house of her aunt, that Mary was born. Mary's mother became quite ill after birth, and so she wasn't able to suckle her child for the first couple of weeks. But luckily, Mary's aunt, so her mother's sister, was just in the process of weaning her own child, so she took on the responsibility of suckling Mary for the first few days of her life. Bear this in mind when I tell you later on that this aunt also becomes Mary's mother-in-law. Yeah. So Mary's mother-in-law suckled her as a baby. It's a very confusing family. But Jedburgh is where she was born, but Burnt Island is where she grew up. Anyone who's been to Burnt Island may have seen this house before. The place where it is has now been renamed Somerville Square in honour of their great resident. But that white house is where Mary grew up. She grew up and absolutely loved it, in part because, as she says, I never cared for dolls and had no one to play with me. I amused myself in the garden, which was much frequented by birds. I knew most of them, their flights and habits. Mary's mother didn't really believe in education, and so long as Mary could say what she needed to in church, because her mother was fairly religious, and did a few household chores, she was allowed to roam free for most of her childhood, except when her father came back. And I just want to show you this map. I love maps. And this one was shared with me by Ian Archbold, who's at the Burnt Island Heritage Trust. And it shows a map of Burnt Island from 1745, so only 25 years before Mary was born. And I love it because Burnt Island today is quite hard to imagine because of the railway that goes through it. So when Mary describes in her autobiography running through 3 sets of gardens to get down to the beach, today you can't picture that. But in this map, you can see the sections of the garden that she would have run through all the way down to the beach. And she spent a lot of her life going up and down to the beach. We've still got the church, which still exists today and still is part of Burnt Island village life. Mary wasn't so keen on the church, but this is the village that she knew and that she grew up in. But when her father did return from one of his voyages, he was disappointed to see that Mary could hardly read or write and had no knowledge of language or numbers. So the family moved for a year to Inveresk, just outside Musselburgh, so that Mary could attend a fashionable and expensive school, Miss Primrose's of Musselburgh High Street. If I go back one slide, this illustration of a girl in an interesting contraption was also shared with me by Ian Archibald. She was sent to the school to learn to write well and keep accounts, which was all a woman was expected to know. But Mary describes, a few days after my arrival, though perfectly straight and well made, I was enclosed in stiff stays with a steel buskin front, while above my frock bands drew my shoulders back until the shoulder blades met. Then a steel rod with semicircle which went under the chin was clasped to the steel busk on my stays. In this constraint state, I and most of the younger girls had to prepare our lessons. The younger ones amongst you in the audience, you might not like your school uniform at the moment, but imagine having to try and learn in a contraption like that. Oh, and whenever I read that out, I always notice I sit slightly better, as if that also reminds me to sit well. She only lasted about a year. They couldn't really afford the fees, and she didn't seem to be learning particularly well. So she stated that she finished her time at the school like a wild animal escaped out of a cage. But she had developed a taste for learning. She had some notion of simple arithmetic, grammar, and French. And when she was back in Burnt Island, there was a local schoolmaster who started to teach her about the globes, both the planet that we live on and also the planets that she could see in the sky. He was the one who started to encourage her to go out at night time and to look up and record what she could see at the sky and how it changed over the year. What's quite interesting about this, though, is that Mary had no idea in her bedroom she was sleeping underneath the planets and the stars. In the 1960s, 1970s, the ceiling in the room that Mary grew up in was taken down. The council owned the building, they were doing repairs, and it all needed to come down. And that's when they discovered this incredible ceiling that had been put up there long before Mary lived there and covered over. So she had no idea, her family had no idea of this incredible ceiling that was looking down on her and the rest of the family. This is just one small section of it. There's an article that you can read. If you Google online, you'll be able to find it. And it tells you all about what they discovered, that Mary actually was underneath. And I can't help feeling that maybe without even realising it, she was being influenced by what was looking down on her as well. As she got a little bit older, 12, 13, 14 or so, she started to come to Edinburgh in the winters. Sometimes on her own, she had an uncle who lived in Edinburgh, and sometimes with her mother. This is, of course, before any of the bridges had been built across the Forth. And in her autobiography, there's lots of descriptions of the boat trips that they had to make from Burnt Island across to Edinburgh and back again. This map is from 1793. And I think one thing that is always tricky to remember as we walk around Edinburgh today is just how small it would have been in the time of Mary growing up. If you look at this, the new town was just starting to be built. They'd started building it in the 1770s. It hadn't been completed yet. And you can see that while Princess Street, George Street and Queen Street are there, beyond that, there's nothing. The places in red that I've highlighted, so the big red box, that's the castle. And then going down, you've got St Giles and the small red box, just so you can kind of see that's where the high street is, and the red line are the north and south bridges. And then if you look north to where the new town is, the blue square, that's where the assembly rooms are. They were opened in 1787, and that's where Mary went to learn how to dance, because of course that's one thing we needed to learn, wasn't it, women? In order to attract a man, we needed to learn how to dance. Beautiful descriptions in her autobiography of learning to dance at Mr. Strange's dancing school, and how dances that happened at the assembly rooms involved a lot of gingerbread and oranges, which I think sounds quite nice, actually. Dancing gingerbread and oranges. Let's go for it. And then the other bit of blue in the new town, where York Place is, was a place that became very important in Mary's education and beyond. It's this building here. And it's at the very top where the white bits are. Does anyone recognise the gentleman in the portrait? He's a painter, if that helps at all. Naismith, well done. This is Alexander Naismith, an incredible painter who also set up at the top of the building that he was living in a drawing school or a painting school for young ladies. So he and his daughters were educating young ladies of Edinburgh how to paint. The way that they did that was that he would paint a painting and then everyone copied. That's how painting was taught in those days. And I think Mary did quite well, actually. This is one of Naismith's paintings. This is one of Mary's. Now, I'm no artist. I'm no expert on art at all. But I think you can see the similarities, I think. You can see how Mary has copied some of the techniques and some of the qualities of Naismith's drawings. She also started to experiment a little bit, and across in Fife, in the Fife archives, I've come across one of my favourite paintings of hers. I think you can possibly guess why that is. I just love it, and it's so different as well. It's very vibrant in colour compared to the previous one, which was quite darker. So you can see that although she did copy Naismith, she was also developing her own skills and experimenting herself. And as I say, I'm no expert, but to demonstrate for me how talented she was as an artist, this is a self-portrait. Now, I don't know about you, my self-portraits tend to be stick figures. That's how good I am at drawing. This is a self-portrait, and I love it, one, because it shows that she continued to paint throughout the rest of her life. Indeed, in her autobiography, she talks about this. It was her way of kind of unwinding and just painting what she could see. Secondly, self-portraits, you control what you're doing in it. And I love the fact that in her self-portrait, Mary wanted to be shown writing. Not sure exactly when this was painted, but it was certainly after several of her books had come out. So it shows how important writing had become to her, that this is what she wanted to show. It was through Naismith's classes that Mary also got to hear of Euclid's works. It was recommended by Naismith as a way of looking at geometry and perspective. And she was able to get, through her brother's tutors, a hold of some of these books. And she says, I had to take part in the household affairs and to make and mend my own clothes. I rose early, played on the piano, painted during the time I could spare in the daylight hours, but I sat up very late reading Euclid. The servants, however, told my mother. It was no wonder the stock of candles were soon exhausted, for Miss Mary sat up reading till a very late hour. Whereupon an order was given to take away my candle as soon as I was in bed. I had, however, already gone through the first 6 books of Euclid, and now I was thrown on my memory, which I exercised by beginning at the first book, and demonstrating in my mind a certain number of problems every night, remember, complete darkness, till I could nearly go through the whole. She would work in the darkness through the problems and then check the next morning if she'd got them right. This is how she educated herself, but it was through the painting that she got to hear about these books in the first place. So this skill that she was being taught simply to attract a man really started to help her with mathematics and geometry and the like. She also, of course, had to learn how to play the piano. And this painting is by J.M.W. Turner. It's an unfinished sketch. It has been titled Music Party, East Cowes Castle, which is down at the very bottom of England. But we're not entirely sure exactly who is portrayed. And there is a large school of thought that actually the woman in black who is playing the piano is Mary Somerville. They knew each other very well. They met each other when they were both in Paris in 1817, and he did a sketch of her while they were in Paris. And the sketch of Mary Somerville and this painting are very, very similar, which is why a lot of people think that that is Mary portrayed there. And it also shows again that the music and the painting, the arts, all of this, which was purely to educate her to be a proper wife, really played a part throughout the rest of her life. Indeed, although music you may just think of being as a lovely thing to play and entertain people with, in her book Connections, Mary drew on the latest experiments of the day to write 2 chapters on sound, introducing the emerging field of acoustics to her readership. So music became very important to her, not just to play, but also from a scientific point of view as well. Another skill you have to learn, of course, how to make food. And she showed off in her autobiography about her orange marmalade skills. Now, I have no evidence whether she was actually any good or not about this, but when she was married a second time to William Somerville, they were living down in London. They were invited by Captain William Edward Parry, seen here on the left, to go and look at his ships that were being prepared for a big voyage to go and try and find the Northwest Passage. This passage that everyone was obsessed about. And she describes that absolutely, they went in and had a look, very much enjoyed it. And as a kind of a going away present, Mary made a whole load of orange marmalade and gave it to Parry and his crew to take away. I haven't yet found any evidence whether they ate it, whether they thought it was any good, or whether they just chucked it out as soon as they could. But on the return to London, Parry announced that a tiny little island in the Barrow Strait was named after the Somervilles. So there's a Somerville Island in the very, very northwest, completely covered in ice. No one lives there, but it's named after them. If it was good orange marmalade, maybe a different island would have been named after. I don't know. Is it is this his way of saying actually the marmalade wasn't that good, so you get an uninhabited island? Who knows? So Edinburgh was very important to Mary in terms of education, Burnt Island as well, but another place I just want to mention in terms of her education is Jedburgh. And it shows you how east coast of Scotland her life was, certainly for the first 20 odd years. Jedburgh not only is where she was born, but she went to visit her aunt and uncle a lot. Her aunt, of course, the one that suckled her for the first few days of her life, but it was her uncle who became really important in her life. He was Reverend Dr. Thomas Somerville, and he was the minister at Jedburgh. So in this old church, attached as part of the church that's still used today. He was author of A History of Great Britain during the reign of Queen Anne, published in 1798. He also gave the first published sermon against the slave trade that was published in 1792. He even met Robert Burns, although Robert Burns recorded in his journal, Mr. Somerville, the clergyman of the place, a man and a gentleman, but sadly addicted to punning. Oh dear. It said that when this journal was published and Somerville read that description, he gave up punning when he read that bit. His autobiography is well worth a read. The Provost of Edinburgh in the 1740s described this vision he had to Thomas Somerville of a new town that is what we now see today. So he was very involved in Edinburgh life, but also Jedburgh life. He was very good friends with Walter Scott and introduced Mary to him. And Mary came down and spent a lot of summers in Jedburgh, slightly better weather than Burnt Island, and spent a lot of time with Thomas Somerville. It was him who encouraged her to educate herself as much as she wanted, saying that in ancient Greece, women were allowed to be educated and would often learn things like mathematics, and he would mention a few names from that time. He started teaching her Latin as well. They discussed Shakespeare and all sorts of things. So the education that she got through Thomas Somerville was also incredibly important. But all of this, of course, is simply for her to get married. And in 1804, at the age of 23, she did get married, not to the man portrayed here. I haven't been able to find a portrait of her first husband. This is her father-in-law, although he was dead by the time they got married, so she never met him. The father and the son, both called Samuel, because why not? Samuel Grieg is sometimes how it's pronounced. They were originally from Inverkeithing, but the Captain Samuel Grieg, who became the Admiral, he was part of the Scottish contingent that went across to Russia to help Catherine the Great set up her Russian navy. So he had a massive career across in Russia. His son also had a very good career in the Russian Navy and then came across back to Scotland because he wanted to find himself a proper Scottish lass to marry. They were connected through family, so it was decided that they would marry each other. The original plan had been whoever Samuel married, they would then go back to Russia, but Mary's parents didn't want that at all. So Samuel gave up his position in the Russian Navy, and instead they travelled down to London where he worked for the consulate. So at the age of 23, almost 24, Mary moves down to London, hundreds of miles away from anyone that she knew. She was abandoned throughout the day by her husband, who was off working. He didn't really think that women should do much. He thought she would be fine just sitting there waiting for him to return. She did go to some lectures and she did do some reading, but really she did what she should do, and she gave birth to 2 children. The first, and I don't know how to pronounce this properly, so if anyone knows Russian, I would love to hear. Woronzow, Woronzow, named after the Russian ambassador in London, was her first son, born in 1805. And then her second son was born, William, in 1807. And it's her first son, Woronzow, whose account, the life of Admiral Sir Samuel Grieg, that I've portrayed in this slide here. He wrote it many years later, and it just shows how proud he was of his grandfather and everything that he did across in Russia. Unfortunately, not really, her husband then dies. And while it may seem strange to take delight in someone's death, I firmly believe if her first husband hadn't died, Mary would never have become the scientist that we know of her today. She was now a widow. She had inheritance. Not a huge amount, but enough to keep her comfortable. She had 2 children. She had done her duty as a woman, so the pressure wasn't there in the same way as it was for single women. So she moved back to Edinburgh. She became very interested in mathematics, something she had first seen as a young child when going through a ladies' magazine. She saw a very strange mathematical equation, which she got told was algebra. As a widow, she carried on her education. She says in her autobiography, "I was chiefly occupied with my children, especially the one I was nursing, but as I did not go into society, I rose early and, having plenty of time, resumed my mathematical studies." She studied mathematics to a point where she started looking at the mathematical problems in a magazine called Mathematical Repository, submitting solutions to the problems, and in June 1811, she won the prize question, a problem which had required a good deal of knowledge of algebra. The editor, William Wallace, seen here in this slide, no, not that William Wallace, that was several centuries before. There's a different William Wallace, just to make that clear. I don't know whether he painted himself blue. There's no evidence for that. He was the editor of the Mathematical Repository, and he was really struck by her workings. And he offered to educate her further in mathematics through correspondence. He eventually became a professor of mathematics at Edinburgh University. His brother was also very much into mathematics and also educated her as well. Winning the prize, she got a medal, shown here, struck for her. This was her prize, a medal. And it's still in the possession of the Somerville College, who have many of the items that she left when she died. They encouraged, both William and John encouraged her to buy mathematical books, but particularly French ones, which became important a little bit later on. Mary was a widow for 5 years, bringing up her sons. And in 1812, she marries for a second time, this one much more successfully. She absolutely seems to have married for love this time round. And she marries William Somerville, whose mother had suckled her as a baby. That connection, very close family. They don't seem to have known each other much as children, but in 1812 they met and fell in love. He was an army doctor, had a liberal outlook, had travelled quite a lot, including in Africa, also very interested in science. And perhaps more importantly, he was very keen that Mary continued her studies. He visited libraries on her behalf, many of which were closed to women. He copied and recopied her manuscripts, did her proofreading, arranged meetings with scientific people. The first 4 years of their marriage, they lived in Edinburgh. They were both already known in the medical and scientific circles, so Mary could continue her studies in mathematics. She took up the study of Greek with her son's tutor, and both her and William started to study mineralogy. And of course, she was also having children. Unfortunately, her second son, William, had died after only a couple of years, but Mary and William had a son who died within the year of his birth in 1814, and 3 daughters. One daughter died aged 10, and Mary described her as a child of intelligence and acquirements far beyond her tender years. She also stated, "I felt her loss the more acutely because I feared I had trained her young mind too much." This was the one daughter who really seemed to have that love of mathematics. And at this time, there was a real fear that if you educated girls too much, it would change their minds, they would go a bit mad, and it could even kill them. And I find it so sad, but also really interesting, that Mary herself, who has received an education, who has proven that women can cope with stuff in their minds beyond the what to cook and does he like me or not, that she's still worried that actually maybe she gave her daughter too much, and that's maybe why. And I think that comes from I've never been in a position of losing someone like that, but I can imagine when you do, the grief that you're in, you're susceptible to what other people have told you, and certainly her parents were the sort that believed too much education would drive girls mad. So maybe at this point of vulnerability, she was hearing this. I would like to say education does not make women mad. Not getting educated can make women get mad. I also want to point out a few other things that people believed in the 19th century. I don't know here, and I am looking particularly at the women here, I don't know if any of you like cycling. This became a thing towards particularly middle and end of the 19th century. There was real fears at the time that cycling would physically change women's faces. Because you know how you can go quite fast, and the wind, you might get stuck like that. There was also a real fear as the railways came along, that if women went on trains which would go quite fast, they might be going so fast that their uterus would just come out of their body. You know what it's like. It's quite difficult to keep hold of it, isn't it? When you're going really fast, you're like, oh no, need to keep everything in. There was a real belief. This is what women were up against. But luckily, Mary now had a very supportive second husband. And although she was absolutely grieving her daughter, they still had 2 daughters surviving and her eldest son as well. So they moved down to London after a few years. And I just wanted to, because I've mentioned families quite a lot, to show you how close everyone was. So in the middle, at the bottom, you've got Mary Fairfax, as she was born, Mary Somerville, as we talk about her now. If you go up through her mother, some Margaret Charters, her father Samuel, his father Samuel, and then down the other side, on the left-hand side, that's how she was connected to her first husband. And then through her mother again, but this time much closer, her second husband. So when we say keeping it in the family, Mary really seems to have taken that quite literally. Down in London, she starts doing experiments. And in 1825, she goes out one day into the garden with a prism just like this. And she covers a needle, half with paper, and through the prism, it splits the sunlight into the different colours. And she was trying to find which colour within the solar spectrum has magnetising powers. So it was a very simple experiment. A prism like this was very easy to get hold of. Every woman, of course, has a needle and a bit of paper, and it was just out in her back garden. And she concluded that magnetism was induced by the blue-green-violet end of the solar spectrum. If you've seen the 2014 film Mr. Turner, then this is talked about in that film quite a lot. You've got Tim Spall there playing Mr. Turner, the great artist, and Leslie Mandeville there playing Mary Somerville. And they talk about it a lot. And in one of Turner's paintings, in the sky, there is a purple streak, and that apparently is in reference to Mary's experiment and what she believed. She wrote up a paper based on her experiment, and the Royal Society published it in their journal. This was the first paper written by a woman they had ever published. However, being a woman, she wasn't allowed in to the Royal Society. Interestingly, when it had first started up in the 1660s, 1670s, they never thought to ban women because they never really thought about women. And then an amazing woman called Duchess of Newcastle, she was Margaret, she was very interested in science. She wanted to go and see what the Royal Society was up to. And they had to let her in because there was no way they could stop her. But almost as soon as she left, they were changing their constitution. No women! And it stayed like that until the middle of the 20th century. So Mary couldn't go in, but her husband did. So if you have a look at the bottom picture, where it has the title of the paper, it says that it's by her, but it was communicated by Mr. W. Somerville. So her husband is the one that is allowed to go into the Royal Society and go, here, my wife's paper. They were, however, allowed to have a bust of a woman, for the Royal Society writes a few years later to Mary stating they had commissioned a bust of her that would go in their grand hall to honour science, their country and themselves, in paying this proud tribute to the powers of the female mind. Lovely, but we won't let you in. That's as close as a woman will get. This experiment soon was proved to be false. In the way that science often is, things move on, technology expands, so different conclusions are reached. Mary doesn't talk about this experiment in her autobiography. She talks about it in some letters, saying that she was deeply ashamed. She seems to have been really embarrassed that as a woman she's done an experiment that a couple of years later is found to be false. Nowadays, scientists, they just take that on board. It's part and parcel of doing science. You're always moving on. But for Mary, it seems to have really damaged her. And she didn't do a huge amount of experiments anymore after that. But she was approached a year after this experiment by the man on the left, Henry Broome. He was actually born in Edinburgh, and they knew each other up here before either of them had moved down to London at all. He wanted her to help bring out a publication. He was 2 years older than Mary. He had trained as a lawyer. He'd entered the House of Commons in 1810. He'd fought against the slave trade. He'd proposed educational reforms. And he was also one of the founders of the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge in 1825. I like how they had to make sure they put the word useful in there, just in case anyone was worried they were too busy giving you unuseful knowledge. He wanted to bring out a condensed English version of a book that the man on the right had written. He is Pierre Simon Laplace. He was born in 1749, a French scholar. He is sometimes referred to as the French Newton. He was a mathematician, astronomer, physicist. He's best known for his investigations into the stability of the solar system. He'd proven once and for all that the heavens were ruled by Newton's laws and that no divine intervention was necessary to keep the celestial orbs gliding along their paths. His book was considered second only to Newton's work. But Laplace was quite a difficult author. A mathematician wrote, Laplace, on the other hand, explains nothing, is indifferent to style, and, if satisfied that his results are correct, is content to leave them either with no proof or with a faulty one. So it was this book that Henry wanted Mary to translate. But translate isn't the right word. Mary agreed on the condition that she would do it in secret, and if the manuscript at the end of it was no good, it would be burnt and never spoken of before. It took Mary 3 years to complete this work. They were living in Chelsea at this point, and she recalls, I rose early, made such arrangements with regard to my children and family affairs that I had time to write afterwards, not, however, without many interruptions. A man can always command his time under the plea of business. A woman has no such excuse. At Chelsea, I was always supposed to be at home, and as my friends' acquaintances came so much out of their way to see me, it would have been unkind and ungracious not to receive them. Nevertheless, I was sometimes annoyed with, in the midst of a difficult problem, someone would enter and say, "I have come to spend a few hours with you," which has slight echoes, I always think, of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, that desire of what women need in order to produce writing. 3 years Mary works on this, and in the end, it didn't fit the series that Henry wanted it for, which was struggling at that point anyway. So her friend John Herschel, who you may have heard of, he did one or two things, he suggested that John Murray might be interested, and it was published. It was published and it was a success, but calling it a translation is not the right word. It wasn't a case of taking the French word and finding an equivalent of English word. In the French, there were no diagrams, there were no tables, there were no explanations. All of that Mary did herself. You needed to have a very high understanding of algebra to understand a lot of what Laplace had done, and then to work out how to get that methodology across to a wider public. It was an incredible amount of work. One of Mary Somerville's friends, the Scottish dramatist and poet Joanna Baillie, expressed her belief that the mechanism of the heavens, as it was published as, had done more to remove the light estimation in which the capacity of women is too often held than all that has been accomplished by the whole sisterhood of poetic damsels and novel-writing authors. It was on the textbook list at Cambridge University for 100 years. It went through several editions, and in 1834, so a year or two later, On the Connection of the Physical Sciences was published, Mary's second book. While preparing The Mechanism of the Heavens, Mary had been struck by the mutual dependence and connection in many branches of science, and that's the theme that she developed for her second book. And it was this second book, the review of which, that called her a scientist. Most people up until this point had concentrated on one branch, maybe two. Mary talked about all of them and gave her the name scientist. It went through several editions, as all of her books did, and Mary continued to update them. Indeed, in the 6th edition, published in 1842, she wrote a prediction that there was another planet out there just waiting to be discovered. She showed a lot of her mathematical thinking around this. Well, a certain man called John Couch Adams read this 6th edition, took on board what Mary said, and in 1846, Neptune was discovered, just as Mary said it would be. In 1835, Mary and Caroline Herschel were elected honorary members of the Royal Astronomical Society, the first time a woman had ever been elected. Although, of course, don't think about coming in. Why would you think about that? Silly. She continued to publish, although by this point, she and her family were living in Italy. By 1840, they were very poor. She was receiving a civil pension in thanks for all of the scientific work that she had done, but her husband, being a very generous man, had lent some money to a cousin who had run off with it. So they decided to move to Italy, which was much cheaper to live, and also his slightly poorer health would hopefully be better in Italy. So Mary now, who by the way was 50 when she published her first book, was the main breadwinner of the family. They didn't have a permanent home in Italy. They moved around depending on the weather. But as the letter I began with shows, she continued to correspond with everyone back in England. And she continued to publish and do lots of editions as well. She did pop back to Britain once in 1844. Oh, let me just briefly tell you about these. Do you recognise the lady on the left? Ada Lovelace, excellent. And the man on the right? Charles Babbage. Ada Lovelace had many mathematical tutors. She is the only legitimate descendant of Byron, his only legitimate child. He didn't see her after a couple of weeks. He disappeared. So she never knew her father. He was the one that was called mad, bad, and dangerous to know. And they were so afraid that his daughter might suffer similar she was not allowed to see a portrait of her father until she was 21, just in case the portrait may have some effect on her mind. Because, us women, we've got such feeble minds, they're so easily influenced. But she was very mathematically minded, just like her mother was. So her mother arranged for several tutors, including Mary Somerville. So Mary Somerville tutored Ada Lovelace. But she did more than that. She was her chaperone. It was through Mary Somerville that Ada Lovelace and Charles Babbage met. And without that meeting, we might not know of Ada Lovelace as potentially the first ever computer programmer. Indeed, there's a program that the US Navy used to, I don't know if they still do use, that is called Ada, after her. And there's an Ada Lovelace Day every year to celebrate the work that she did. Charles Babbage is an interesting character in his own right, a bit of a grumpy man by all accounts. But Ada and he worked very well together, and it came about through Mary. Ada died quite young, but she met her husband, Lord Lovelace, through Mary's eldest son. He introduced them. And when Ada became a mother herself, she also continued to write to Mary for support in how to juggle work and motherhood, something that we are still struggling with today. This portrait was painted in 1844, which is when Mary popped back to Britain for a visit. And while she came to Edinburgh, you think about it, Edinburgh would have been even bigger at that point than she had known. She went to a certain Addy & Sons shop on Princes Street, and there she purchased a microscope, which can still be seen. This is at the History of Science Museum down in Oxford. It's been described to me as like a starter kit. If you're wanting to learn how to use a microscope and what can be seen, this is the kind of kit that you would get. So Mary, even though she's now 63, has decided that she wants to learn something new. And so she buys herself a microscope kit. It came with some slides that were pre-populated with things to look at, and then some slides where you could put things in yourself. And this influenced her so much that the last book to be published in her lifetime, when she was 89 years old, was on the microscopic science. It wasn't as successful as her other books, but it was still hugely important. And it shows how she was still educating herself, even when she was at an age when most people would have gone, do you know, I'm just going to sit and relax. I'm in Italy, just have a glass of wine. She continued to want to know. Indeed, in her last year, she wrote a letter to Murray, who she still kept in touch with on a regular basis, saying how every day she practiced 5 hours of mathematics. Every single day, she was 91. Does anyone here do mathematics for 5 hours a day at whatever age you may be? No. It was in Naples that she died, and she'd always stated that wherever she died is where she should be buried. There was a cemetery in Naples called the English Cemetery, and in the 19th century, this is where the English society were buried if they needed to be buried in Naples. This is not my photograph, though. It is still in place above Mary's tomb. And in February 2020, when I turned 40, I thought I would celebrate by going to Naples. I wanted to go and see Mary. And I got there, only to discover the cemetery is now completely closed. Because no one looks after it. Who would look after a bunch of English people? The whole cemetery has fallen apart, and it's too dangerous to let the public in. So all I could see as I peered through the gates was just a tiny little bit of her toe. And there was me, a mad British person, going, Mary, I'm here. One day I'm hoping I'll be able to go back and maybe actually get in and see. I'll briefly end in the last few seconds just by talking about her legacy. Perhaps the biggest legacy of all is Somerville College. So Mary died in 1872 and had no idea that this college was going to be named after her. It opened in 1879, and they wanted to choose the name of a female role model. And the most important one they could think of was Mary Somerville. She also played a role in the suffrage movement. When women were arguing that we should be allowed to vote, because again, there were a lot of people who thought putting an X in a box would make women go a bit mad, or that they would vote the way that their husbands told them to, and therefore the Tories would forever be in power. Anyway, when they were trying to protest and say we should be allowed to vote, they sometimes put on protests where they held banners of women from the past who were incredible. And this is the contemporary suffrage banner that was made, that was held aloft, and shows how proud women were that Mary Somerville had been there. Next time you're in the moon, if you go to the eastern part of the moon, there's a crater named after her. And on your way to the moon, make sure you watch out for a main belt asteroid that was discovered on the 21st of September 1987 that's also named after her. In 2017, she was the first non-royal female to appear on a Royal Bank of Scotland note, the £10 note. There is a Mary Somerville medal that the Society of Physics give out from time to time. The Mary Somerville Room at Scottish Parliament, and the data centre at Edinburgh University in the James Clerk Maxwell building is also named after her. And these 3 fiction books are just a small example of how she's now starting to be weaved into fiction stories as well. And the picture on the bottom right always makes me smile. Last year there was an incredible musical called Scots. It was telling the history of Scotland through music from the point of view of a toilet. It was hilarious and very strange indeed. I wasn't going to go and see it, but a friend messaged me going, Mary sings. Mary Somerville is in it and she sings. So naturally I had to go and see it. And this lovely actress, Lauren, she portrays Mary. So the song before it is all these men in the toilets coming up with these inventions and talking about how brilliant they were. And she walks down in the aisle going, excuse me, what about us women? She sings a song and then brings lots of other women on board going, hey, we're also great. And we don't need to go to a toilet to do our best thinking. But perhaps the biggest legacy that Mary has left is the fact that she inspires so many people today. This is me, obviously, on the right-hand side, and my very good friend Bridget Stenhouse on the left, whose PhD she got through studying Mary's mathematics. She's written an amazing article about Mr. Somerville, Mr. Mary Somerville, looking at the husband. And there are many more people who are starting to study Mary a lot more. So she continues to inspire. This portrait is in the Scottish National Portrait Gallery, just down in Queen Street. So you can go, pop along, wave hello to Mary, and remember all the incredible things that she did. Thank you for listening.
Questions? Any questions in the house? There's one right there.
How many books did she write?
How many books did she write?
She write herself?
Yes, she wrote 5 books, 4 of which went through several editions, and she wrote the re-editions, most of them herself. She also wrote a draft book that was published after her death, her autobiography. It's well worth a read, but I would recommend you get the version that's published by Canongate, edited by Dorothy Macmillan, who sadly died fairly recently, because she has looked at the book that was published, which was brought out by Mary's daughter, and therefore heavily edited, and she's added in from the draft manuscripts that still exist of what Mary had actually written, so you can see how her daughter really didn't want you to know that Mary had been taught how to swear as a kid. That bit was definitely taken out. No one must know that about my mother. So that edition is really interesting because you can see the way that portrayal in society changed even in the couple of years before it came out. So I guess you could say 6 books if you included the autobiography, but certainly 5 in her lifetime.
Thank you, Ruth, for a fascinating talk. I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned that she knew the Herschels, John Herschel and Caroline Herschel. Could you say a little bit more about that relationship? It
was an incredible relationship. She knew slightly his father, William, and in fact, as William Somerville and Mary Somerville travelled down to London in 1816, where they were moving to, on the way there they stopped off in Slough so they could see the telescope that William Herschel had set up there. But in London, she got to know John Herschel a lot. And the Royal Society have an incredible collection of his letters, which I think they're digitising at the moment to bring up online. And it seems to have been a relationship of equals. they had this real fascination with mathematics and also astronomy, and they wrote to each other about what they were reading and what they were discovering. And John Herschel would send her manuscripts to go, oh, can you check this for me? Have I got this right? And she would do the same. He was the one who supported her by getting John Murray interested in publishing her first book. They kept in touch. He was at Cambridge University. She actually visited Cambridge University. After the success of her first couple of books, she was invited to go there. She stayed there overnight, possibly the first female to have stayed in part of Cambridge University with her husband, and that was all through John Herschel. They kept in touch throughout his life, because sadly he predeceased her. Mary, by living so long, most of her friends and her family died while she was still alive. She lost all but 2 of her children. Her 2 husbands died, her parents and her siblings also. And most of her friends who were particularly influential, like John Herschel, they all predeceased her.
Anything else in the room? No, this one here.
Was there a point where she realised, this was a sort of career for her, because she's obviously had to, publish her 5 books.
Yeah.
Because everything else sort of, maybe for the first 60 years sounds like it's kind of just bumped along, by happenstance.
It's really hard to know whether she thought of it as a career or not, in part because careers have slightly different meaning now than it does then, and it's certainly, her first book being published when she was 50, I don't think she'd ever considered publishing anything like that before. But what's really interesting, even before she had published anything, so when she visited France in 1817, and this was before she published anything at all, Laplace knew who she was. She met Laplace and he knew who she was. So even though she hadn't published anything, her name was well known within scientific circles already. So I think that's probably what she was thinking that she would be doing. Lots of reading, lots of taking on information, lots of writing to different people, and maybe doing some experimentations herself. I often play that game of what if, and I am intrigued to know, given that the experiment that she did in 1825 was then not a success, if she hadn't been asked to translate Laplace's book, would she have given up completely? It's hard to know. It's almost like being asked to do Laplace's translations gave her a second boost or a second chance. And that's what she then kind of concentrated on. She still did a few bits of experiments, but she never really published an article in the same way. And she seems to have kept that a lot more quiet. But publication then became her way. She was absolutely desperate for women to get education. That was her one big thing, and I think in some ways she saw her publications as proof that women could be educated and could also help educate others. The fact that her books were on university textbooks, so universities that were very much not for women, well, her books, written by a woman, were then being used to educate the next generation of males. I think she got a taste for publication after that first book, because she wasn't approached to publish the others. They all came out of her own ideas. So the first one, absolutely, she was asked to do, but then the rest, she went and came up with her ideas and went, oh, what about this? And then published. I think having the pressure of being the breadwinner also played a part in that, definitely. But I also get the impression that she was... It's hard to put emotions and thoughts on people in the past, but I like to think that she was quite proud of what she did. The fact that she thought an autobiography, that there was room for that, I think shows that she was quite proud of the fact that she, a woman who was educated only really to the point of getting a husband, look at what I have done, kind of thing.
Can we move to Zoom for questions?
Zoom, I think Ian is co-host on Zoom.
And there are quite a lot of compliments.
Yeah, thank you.
From Margaret Campbell saying it's the best Somerville lecture she was there.
Let me know where to send the money to, Margaret. I'll post it.
I'd like to make a point if I could, please.
Yep, sure.
Is that okay? You can hear me? Yeah, there are 2 things that I want to draw your attention to here, and they relate to the observatory being built on Carlton Hill.
Mm-hmm.
Could it possibly Wallace, you mentioned, the professor of mathematics at the university, he trained the first astronomer royal for Carlton Hill, Thomas Henderson, who was a Scot from Dundee. So it's possible that Henderson crossed paths with Mary Somerville.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's a second way in which he may have crossed paths with her, because Amy and his sons, they were very heavily involved in the setting up of the astronomy on Carlton Hill. And Thomas Henderson, the first astronomer royal, and I just mentioned, married Amy's daughter, Janet Amy. So there's a whole collection of stuff there. I'd be certain that she crossed paths with the first astronomer royal.
That's amazing. I would definitely have a look at that. In fact, I'm going to just, quickly screen. That's horrible to look at. I know, apologies. But I just want to get to the title page just with my email address on. If you ever come across anything, I would absolutely love to know more about that.
I might be able to find out about the Russian connection as well.
Please do.
I'll try for you.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I know I'm probably really butchering the pronunciation of the son, so I quite often just refer to him as her eldest son, and that way I hopefully won't offend too many people, but I would love to know how to pronounce it properly. Thank you so much.
Can we
just spell it again? I can watch through the whole thing and get it back again. Can you spell it?
W-O-R-O.
Yeah.
Hold on. Where is it? Orange marmalade.
We'll put it in the chat.
Yes, good idea. We'll put it in the chat.
I can search. Don't worry, I can search for it.
Right. Can we? Is there anything on YouTube?
No, there's no questions on YouTube, but it's been very well received, and what an amazing talk, Ruth. Absolutely fabulous.
Thank you. Thank you, Mum and Dad.
Okay, thank you very much, and we'll thank you again. That was
Thank
very,
you.
very good. And now it's over to Alan. Well, I think you're Mr. Brace's man from now on. Move that out of your way. Yeah, I'll take that one. I'll switch myself off.
No, I think it's the other way. Is it the other way around? No, it is right.
Can I just go? Is that a thumbs up? It's in the dark. Yeah. Okay. Hi. Can you hear me? Yes. Right. The sky in May 2024. Well, I'm starting with the highlight of last month of April, because that was the solar eclipse on the 8th of April. This view was obtained by our ASE secretary, Sean Wickstead, who had a superb view of the eclipse from Dallas in Texas. And you can see this view of the totally eclipsed sun. You can see the prominences, those pink splodges around the limb of the sun, and the white outer atmosphere of the sun, the corona reaching out into space. I'm sure that Sean had a much better view of the corona with the naked eye. It stretches many solar diameters away from the sun, but most of the photos I've seen just concentrate on the prominences and the phenomena close to the limb of the sun. Now, that eclipse, of course, stretched right across the USA and into eastern Canada, and areas around that saw a partial solar eclipse, and the region in which partial solar eclipse was visible extended as far east as Scotland. And another member, Robert Arnold, in Sky has posted this image of the partially eclipsed sun. It was only visible as a partial eclipse for a matter of minutes before the sun set from Scotland. He got this from Sky, but I understand that the picture actually taken by his wife, Anne. But a brilliant image, I think you'll agree, of the partial eclipse. Now let's look at what's happening with the sun this month. This is the data of sunrise, sunset times, and also twilight times for various dates through to the middle of June. These times, by the way, are BST times, not GMT. And you may notice that our dark nights are disappearing fast. The times of nautical twilight for nautical twilight here disappear by the end of the month. And so we don't get complete darkness after the end of June. And even already we're into the region where there is no astronomical twilight, so it doesn't get completely dark even now. Nautical twilight, by the way, is the times when the sun is 12 degrees below the northern horizon in the middle, 12 degrees below the horizon. And in the middle of, at the end of June, at the end of May, the sun falls less than 12 degrees below the horizon in the north, so nautical twilight lasts all night. These are the moon's phases for the month. The moon is full, the new moon is on next Wednesday, and the moon is full on the 23rd of May. The full moon in May is called the flower moon for perhaps obvious reasons. Other names for it include the milk moon, the corn planting moon, and the hare moon. The hare moon because hares are said to reproduce rapidly and were held in pagan times as a symbol of fertility and regeneration. That's why it's the hare moon. Turning our attention to the solar system in May, the curving yellow line along that diagram shows the path of the sun during the course of the year. And this is the 360 degrees of the equatorial region of the sky stretched out across the screen. The sun's continuing to climb northwards. This line is called the ecliptic. The sun's continuing to climb northwards during May, moving from Aries into Taurus. Now, as far as the planets go, I could almost stop there, because none of the planets are easily seen at all, since they're all rather close to the sun in the sky, or to the south and west of the sun in the sky, so they're very low in our eastern morning twilight. In fact, they're in this region of the sky to the south and west of the sun. And in that region, well, there are the planets, the brighter planets that are there. On the 16th of May, when this diagram is actually drawn for, Jupiter is on one side of the sun, but Venus, Mercury, Mars, and Saturn are on the other side of the sun, and all of them are rather subsumed in our morning twilight. In fact, two of the planets this month have meetings with the sun on May the 9th. Mercury is not meetings with the sun, but Mercury is furthest west of the sun on the 9th of May, when it's 26 degrees, about as far as it can get away from the sun in the sky. And on May the 18th, Jupiter is in conjunction on the sun's far side. Saturn is the furthest away from the sun, and it's just about barely visible at the moment, and will improve during the course of the month, and with the same relative size in the sky. Mars is next nearest to the sun from Saturn, and they're both about the same magnitude, minus 1.2, so they're difficult to see in the dawn twilight. But let's take a look at where they are. This is the view looking east at the start of civil twilight tomorrow morning. Now, civil twilight, I mentioned nautical twilight, the sun's 12 degrees below the horizon. For civil twilight, the sun is 6 degrees below the horizon. So at this moment, tomorrow morning, May the 4th, 4:36 BST is when the sun is 6 degrees below the horizon and climbing, so the sky is getting brighter. And you can see Saturn is quite low down to the south of east, and Mars is even lower. just rising in the east. So I don't think you're going to see Mars tomorrow. You might just see Saturn, probably need binoculars to catch it, and you'll need to look about 3 degrees high at that time. And if you can find Saturn, look below and to its left for the moon, and the moon here is shown at twice its actual size in the sky. And if you look at the moon in close-up tomorrow morning, then that's the phase it would have 21% sunlit. If we turn to the end of the month, May the 31st, the same sort of chart, the start of civil twilight in the morning at 3:39 BST by May 31st, and you'll see Saturn's a good deal higher. It's around 8 degrees high and slightly further to the south. And on that morning, the moon is again alongside Saturn, but on the other side and slightly lower. And there's the appearance of the moon on that occasion. Mars is over here, just becoming high enough that you might stand a chance of seeing it at the end of May. Once again, there are the appearances of the planets. In fact, these are drawn for the May 16th, but the appearance doesn't change that quickly. If you look at Saturn, you'll notice quite a change over what we've seen Saturn over recent years. The rings are getting close to edge on, so they're quite narrow as the Earth approaches the ring plane of the planet, approaches the equatorial plane of Saturn. While we're looking in the eastern sky, I've got to mention a meteor shower, the Eta Aquarids meteor shower. This is one of the most active showers of the year, but as with the planets this month, it's much better seen from the southern hemisphere. The radiant is there in Aquarius, and it rises in the east at about 3 o'clock in the morning, BST, and it stands only 13 degrees high at the start of civil twilight. So we have only a fairly brief window to see its meteors, the shower's meteors, which are rapid, fast, but none of them are visible until the radiant rises. So reports you'll see about them being spectacular during the night, they're just not true. It's only visible in the morning twilight. Meteors, of course, fly away from the radiant, visible in all parts of the sky, but their paths point back to where the radiant lies, the direction in space from which the meteoroids are traveling. And there are some details about the shower. It's already active. It lasts pretty well the whole of the month, but the peak is due on May the 5th at about 22 hours BST. And of course, that time the radiant is below the horizon, so you won't see meteors at that time. But on May the 6th is probably the best time to look for Eta Aquarids meteors. They're fast, a bit like the Leonids and a bit like the Perseids. They can leave trains in the sky, glowing columns of ionization in their wake. And the zenithal hourly rate of 40 is the number you would see if the radiant was overhead, but of course it's not. It's so low down in the sky that the zenithal hourly rate is much less than the hourly rate is much less than 40. There is no moonlight interference this year. The moon is not yet new, but it's not impacting the sky's brightness, and it's very much a shower that's better seen from the southern hemisphere. Okay. This is the negative version of the chart that appears each month in the Scotsman and also on the Society's website. It's valid at these times, so it corresponds to midnight BST in the middle of May. And it usually point out a few features. One of them is the plough, which at this time of the year is pretty well overhead as it gets dark and is starting to tumble down into the west by these times. Facing the plough across the other side of Polaris, the pole star, is the W of Cassiopeia, which is starting to climb into the northeastern sky. Leo, of course, is a favorite constellation in the spring, and that's now past its best and is dipping down into the west. The brightest object in the sky is the star Arcturus, which is in Boötes and is fairly high in the southern sky at nightfall. I'll come back to that later. And not far away from Boötes is the constellation of Corona Borealis, which again is extremely interesting at the moment because we've got two interesting variable stars to check, and I'll get onto that shortly. Here's the view Stellarium gives us looking south at midnight BST in the middle of the month. The moon is over here on the 16th in Leo. But I'll plot it on a few other nights in the month to show you how it progresses across the sky. On May the 15th, it's here above the star Regulus, the brightest star in Leo, the one that sits at the bottom of the reversed question mark, that's the sickle of Leo. May 16th, I said, is there, and by the 19th and 20th, the moon is passing the star Spica, which is also bright in our southern sky, but not as high as Arcturus. And by May the 23rd, the moon is right alongside the star Antares in Scorpius, very low down in the south. Now, I've mentioned Arcturus is the brightest star on the map, the brightest star in Arcturus, the brightest star north of the equator of the sky. But it's only just a little bit fainter than Vega in Lyra, which is over here, just about making it onto the diagram, more towards the east. Now, about 20 degrees above and to the left of Arcturus is this constellation of Corona Borealis. And it's in that region I want to focus just now. Now, Corona is an ancient constellation. It was first catalogued by the Greek astronomer Ptolemy in the 2nd century, and it's said to represent the crown of Ariadne, the daughter of King Minos in Greek mythology. If we look in that box, look at the constellation in close-up, this is Stellarium's view of Corona Borealis. The brightest star in the crown has dual names. It's sometimes called Alphecca and sometimes called Gemma. The latter name, Gemma, means jewel in Latin, but Alphecca comes from the Arabic for the bright one of the broken ring, because it's not a complete crown, not a complete ring, but it's the brightest one, brightest star in there. It shines at magnitude 2.2, just slightly fainter than Polaris, and it's just slightly variable for the same reason that Algol in Perseus is a variable star. It's an eclipsing variable star, but with a very short, very narrow range of brightness of only about 1/10 of a magnitude, which is just about, well, barely visible to the eye. And it takes 17 days between the main eclipses, barely perceptible to our eyes. Now, Gemma or Alphecca is normally the brightest star in this constellation, but back in 1866, the Irish astronomer John Birmingham reported that a star was also at the 2nd magnitude, just southeast of the crown, and it's there. And it's come to be known, being given the variable star designation of T Corona Borealis. It's visible normally, this star, at around the 10th magnitude. Too faint to see through binoculars, but easily within range of telescopes, shining around the 10th magnitude. But every now and again, well, it certainly happened in 1866, and it did the same thing in 1946. It brightened up to rival Alphecca in brightness for a short time. And there are suggestions that there have been earlier outbursts that may have been observed in the years 1217 and 1787. And as you'll see, we're expecting a repeat performance in the next few months, so perhaps by September or so. So we need to keep an eye on Corona Borealis. The outburst of Corona in 1946 is plotted on this diagram here. And you can see normally it's around about the 10th magnitude faint, but back in early in 1946, it suddenly flared up to, well, it shows here the 3rd magnitude, which is a little bit faint, just a bit fainter than Alphecca, but still comparable with its brightness in 1866. And then it fell away quite rapidly in brightness back to its normal, eventually reaching its normal brightness. So this is the sort of thing we're expecting to happen again any time now, and people have been, as you might expect, keeping a fairly close eye on it. And one of the worries I had about writing about this in my Scotsman article, and in fact preparing this talk tonight, is that it may have blown before I got to present the talk. So it's not, because this is the latest measurements in this plot of its brightness over the last 2 years. The latest measurement on this diagram was made this morning, So it's still not blown. But you can see, I think, that something's happening. It seems to be varying. This slow pulsation is thought to be due to the larger of one of two stars that make up T Corbeau. It's thought that the star is, in fact, a pair of stars, a red giant and a small, hot dwarf star, which are orbiting each other every 228 days. That's an artist's impression of what we've got here. A red giant star and a white dwarf star in the middle of this disk of material which is being drawn away from the red giant and is spiraling down onto the white dwarf. Now that material is thought to build up on the white dwarf, and eventually it triggers a runaway nuclear fusion reaction and a massive outburst of energy, and that blows off the excess material, the material that's built up, the surviving material that's built up. It blows that off into space, and of course we see the nova flare that we are expecting imminently. This is probably how all novae occur or originate in that we see. Excuse me. The difference being that ordinary novae have a much longer period between outbursts, and so we just see typically only one outburst. In the case of T Corbeau, we've seen at least two, and expecting the third. The oscillations, the main oscillations you see in the light curve, are thought to be due to pulsations of the red giant star. But there is a further oscillation superimposed on that, a much more rapid oscillation, a sort of twinkling. And this is some results from the Del Rado telescope at ASERO Observatory in Spain, stretching a little more than 2 hours long and showing the brightness of the T Corbeau. Of course, we only measure the total brightness of the two stars. We can't separate them through a telescope. And you can see that even on a timescale of minutes, the star is varying by quite a while, quite a range in brightness, 50% or more, as it sort of twinkles. And its behavior just now is a suggestion that it is about to explode again. So check Corona Borealis and look for T Corbeau whenever you get a clear night, and you may be one of the first to recognize that it's doing its thing. It's likely to be brief, though, dropping back to below naked eye visibility within a week or so at the most. So it's just a few days of extraordinary brightness that we don't normally see. Now, while you're looking for T Corbeau, take a look at another variable star in Corona. Normally it's the brightest star in the crown, which is this one, which is our Corona Borealis. It's got a different variable star designation. Now, it does a sort of reverse behavior to T Corbeau. Normally it's bright and around the 6th magnitude, so it's visible through binoculars easily. Normally it's bright and at that brightness through binoculars, but every now and again it dips in brightness, sometimes well below binocular brightness, and to become a faint telescopic object. And then again, as a reverse to what T Corbeau does, it takes a little while to recover its brightness, but it does eventually recover. If you plot T Corbeau's brightness, this is over 4 years, the last 4 years, again to the current time. You can see that in this time it's been spent most of the time at around magnitude 6, and so visible through binoculars, and it's still there at the moment. But twice here, once in 2019, and again almost exactly a year ago, it's dipped down in brightness and then takes a few weeks or months to recover. So it dipped down last year and took until last May, in fact, and took until about November to recover its brightness. What's happening is we think that the star of our Corbeau is actually a star which has clouds of soot in the star's atmosphere that form in its atmosphere. And the soot hides the brightness, hides the light, and eventually the soot is blown away by the radiation from the star, and so the star recovers. But we don't know, we can't predict when these fades will occur, but it should be easy to spot through binoculars if it does. As I say, at the moment it's near its usual magnitude 6, but it's well worth checking whether R Corps is visible every time you check to see if T Corps is visible. Let's turn to look again at the south sky, at the southern sky at midnight BST in the middle of the month. I've mentioned Arcturus and Corona Borealis, and forming something of an equilateral triangle with them is M5, which is south east of Arcturus and about the same distance away from Arcturus as Corona Borealis. This is one of the brightest and easily seen globular clusters in our sky. And there's an image of it taken by Mark Phillips. M5 is about magnitude 5.6, so it's brighter than our Corona Borealis. It's 24,500 light years away from us. It extends around on the sky about 3/4 the size of the moon, and it contains hundreds of thousands of stars that formed altogether around 10.6 billion years ago. So they're about more than twice as old as the sun and the Earth. But it's not the only interesting globular cluster visible. If you take that line, if you take a line from Arcturus to Vega in the sky, well, it cuts right across Corona Borealis, and it cuts also across what's called the keystone of Hercules, this pattern of 4 stars which represent a keystone, same shape as a keystone, which is the top stone of an arch that locks the 2 sides together. Now, along the western edge of the keystone of Hercules is another globular cluster, M13, and this is an image taken by Dougie Smart of the Society. I think he took this less than a week ago of M13, sometimes called the Hercules cluster or the Great Globular in Hercules. It's very slightly fainter than M5. It's very slightly smaller than M5 in its size on the sky, but it's even older than M5. Instead of being 10.6 billion years old, this is 11.6 billion years old. So it really does date from the very early, the stars really do date from the very early phase of our universe. This is the view looking west at midnight in the middle of the month. Leo is sinking into the west. It's still fairly high in the south-southwest as darkness falls, but by midnight BST in the middle of the month, it's dipping down into the western sky. And you've also got, on the 16th of May, the moon still in Leo. And as I did when I look south, I'll superimpose the moon's position on a few other dates in the month. On May the 8th, in fact, is when new moon occurred, or occurs. And there is an outside chance that we could see the moon on that evening of May the 8th, very low in the northwest on that evening. We have a better chance on the 9th, when it's 4 degrees high, when nautical twilight ends. And on that evening, the 9th, it's 4% sunlit, and visible as a thin U-shaped sliver of light at around 23 hours BST. On the 10th, it appears on this chart. Here we are. It lies to the left of the star El Nath, one of the horns of Taurus. And on that evening, it's 10% sunlit, so it'll still be brightly Earth-lit. It's below Pollux in Gemini on the 12th, and above right of the Praesepe cluster in Cancer on May the 13th. And that takes us on to the 15th, which I've already mentioned. It's just above Regulus in the sky. Something else to look for lies in this area, and I'll expand that region of sky in the next diagram, and that's a comet. It's comet C2023A3, Chushin-san Atlas, and it was discovered at the start of last year. And this diagram shows its motion from east to west during the course of May and to the middle of June. It's 11 degrees above right of Spica at present, and it's thought to be about magnitude 10. So it's a telescopic object, photographic object, and 267 million kilometers away tonight. There's an image from Douglas Heggie taken on April the 27th. Now, some predictions have this comet put it brighter than magnitude 0, brighter than Arcturus, when it reaches perihelion on September the 27th. At that time, it'll be 59 million kilometers from the Sun, around the same distance as Mercury. And although we won't see it at perihelion because it'll be hidden in the Sun's glare, we stand a good chance of it being still bright enough to be an impressive object as it climbs above the western horizon at nightfall during October. So something to look forward to. That's the view looking north in our tour of the sky. Capella in Auriga is conspicuous low down in the northwest. That's also as bright as Vega. Vega is over here, climbing in the northeast or in the east. The Milky Way is stretching between Auriga and Cygnus, but because of the twilight at this time of the year, I doubt if you'll see the Milky Way at all well. The Milky Way is stretching through Perseus and Cassiopeia, but we've got the twilight. Now, as you've probably noticed on earlier sky views, the plough is just about overhead. Here it is. Overhead point is around here at this time. And so I thought I'd show how the plough can be used as a signpost in the sky. And it helps us to find directions to other constellations. Not that the plough is a constellation, it's an asterism, a part of the constellation of Ursa Major. And so we'll center on the plough. This is the view of the sky centered on the bowl of the plough with radial lines and showing different directions towards north, upwards, and south, downwards, and west in this direction, and east over here. And also circles every 10 degrees away from the plough. Of course, the two pointers here point upwards towards Polaris, and that's just one of the ways that we can use the plough as a signpost. If I show them there, that's the pointers pointing to stars Dubhe and Merak in the plough, pointing the way to Polaris. Of course, when the plough's overhead, that arrow is pointing downwards. But you can also use the tail or the handle of the plough to find the star Arcturus. If you follow the curving line of the handle of the plough, that brings you to Arcturus. If you take a line along the top of the bowl of the plough here, between those two stars, that points to Capella, which at the moment is lower down in the northwest. And if you take a line diagonally across the bowl of the plough, that points to Castor and Pollux in the west. And the line on the opposite side of the bowl of the plough to the pointers points down more or less directly to Regulus in the sickle, at the base of the sickle of Leo. So that's how you can use the plough as a compass in the sky, as a signpost. But let's focus on the plough itself. This is Stellarium's view of the plough. Now, other names for the plough include the saucepan, the Big Dipper, or Charles's Wain, and it comprises the brightest stars of constellation of Ursa Major, the Great Bear. I've already mentioned the pointers. The brightest star in the plough is Alioth, in the handle of the plough. Here it is, magnitude 1.8. And the faintest is the star that joins the bowl to the handle, Megares, which is magnitude 3.3, a quarter as bright as Alioth, so they're not all the same brightness. Perhaps the most interesting of the brightest stars in the plough is Mizar, which is this one. And that one is a double star. Here is a photograph taken by Mark Phillips showing Mizar and its companion Alcor, sometimes called the horse and the rider. The magnitudes 2 and 4. And Mizar, in fact, is also a double itself. They are 14 arc seconds apart, so you need a telescope to separate them. and they orbit with thousands of years period. And each of these stars you see is also binary, very close binaries. So there's 6 stars, if you like, in all. All of them lie around 83 light years from us. Now, looking near to the Plough, we have a couple of galaxies quite close to the end star in the Plough, Alkaid. And first of them is M101, the Pinwheel galaxy. And on the other side of Alkaid is M51, the Whirlpool. And both of them are very nice photographic targets. And ASARO obtained some data on M101, the Pinwheel, which has been processed by Eros Tang to produce this wonderful image of that spiral galaxy. And Andrew Farrow, who's here today, obtained this image of M51, the Whirlpool. Now, M101 is 21 million light years from us, and it's about twice as wide as our Milky Way. There are lots. There are, I think, 1,264 at the last count. There are lots of H2 regions, those pink glowing splodges in the galaxy. There are regions like the Orion Nebula in our sky, in our galaxy, where new stars and planets are forming. M51 over here consists of 2 interacting galaxies at 24 million light years. Now, the larger one is similar in size to our Milky Way, and the smaller one is also called NGC 5195, and that's a dwarf galaxy, and you can see they are gravitationally interacting. Material is being drawn between them. Yes, well, I think the sea star does very well, to be honest. Okay, let's back to our view of the Plough and click for this line across, diagonal line across the Plough, across the bowl of the Plough, and if you take the same distance again, it comes to a pair of galaxies, M81, M82, another photographic, another interesting pair of photographic photogenic galaxies. This is an image by Eros Tang of them both, M82 and M81. M82 is called the Cigar Galaxy, M81 is Bode's galaxy, but in fact they were both discovered by Bode. M82 is in some ways the more interesting object. It's an image by Ian Smith of this parish. It's called a starburst galaxy because the central regions appear to be exploding as some large young stars, emphasis being on young, reach the end of their lives and disintegrate as supernovae, throwing out tendrils of gas and dust which appear red in this image. The starburst activity was probably, or the star formation that caused the young stars to be formed and then die, was probably caused by the gravitational interactions between these 2 galaxies, between the Cigar Galaxy and Bode's galaxy. The 2 lie 12 million light years away, and stars are thought to be forming in M82 at something like 10 times the rate at which stars form in our galaxy. Just a month ago, the JWST released this image of the central region of M82, and they're doing some research as to what's really happening inside this galaxy, but you can see there some more detailed views of that material that's being blasted out from the central regions of the galaxy. M81, well, is there in a photograph taken by Mark. Also 12 million light years away, so the 2 are quite close together in space. But this is a more classic spiral galaxy, and it's just a bit bigger than the Milky Way. Both galaxies you can see through binoculars on a dark night, possibly not in May, but we can see these, because they're circumpolar, we can see these throughout the year. They can be seen as small smudges, and they're quite easy to spot through any telescope. But not, as I say, in the worst of our summer twilight, which we're going to have to suffer right through July. I haven't looked east yet in the midnight period. This is the view looking east. I haven't got a lot to say about this. There are lots of interesting things coming up in this region of sky to look at over the next few months, twilight permitting. The highlight, of course, has to be the summer triangle formed by joining up Vega in Lyra to Altair in Aquila and Deneb in Cygnus. But I say these objects and this summer triangle will dominate our views over the coming summer months. And that's all I have for you this month. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Alan, for your informative and comprehensive view of the next month's sky. I think that finishes the formal part of this evening's entertainment. There is a video of Eros Tang's amazing work, which we'll play through the system while we have tea and coffee. So let's thank our speakers again for tonight.